I'm really a shy kind of guy, so I don't know how to start right now.
You send a hat around and collect.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It means a lot to me. It really does. Thank you so much. And I guess on that note, if I don't get a chance to thank you, I would have said thank you anyway at the beginning. This has been particularly special for me, and to be asked to come back, I didn't hesitate. I simply said it's in your hands. You've been most gracious. I've met so many interesting people. Thank you for the emails and so forth. And Osher is fabulous, you know. If I'm still around, I will be in that seat, and if I hear that you're going where you're going and you're going to celebrate and so forth, I wish I could be there, etc. So I didn't know what day it was today. It's true to say I didn't know what day it was today. I thought tomorrow would be today. And of course I was thinking, as I usually do, about where I might start. And had thought then I would start by talking about tomorrow, which is today. But then and of course, as I said at the door, it gives you a sense of my state of mind, doesn't it? Which is not a negative thing. It's an entirely positive thing. So what I simply would say is, I did find the analogy, the attempt to write an autobiography in an entire lifetime, actually in an infinity. That was a paradox that was invented by Bertrand Russell, and it's known as the paradox of Tristram Shandy. So I doggedly pursued that until I found that paradox. And the thing is, I was going to start with that, but then I decided not to. And I decided instead to start with tomorrow, because it's today, which is my mother's birthday. Now, of course, if my mum was around, I'd be celebrating that with her. But my mum always used to tell me, well, she told me many things. And she would tell me to switch my computer off now because it's making sounds, which it shouldn't be making. And so if I could figure out how to do that, I would do that as well. And there it is, all my email. And now I don't know how to get back to the lecture, but I'll figure that out in a moment. She used to say to me, you know, Clive, I was born on the 11th minute of the 11th hour of the 11th day, and she would describe to me what that meant. She would talk to me about Armistice Day and the huge significance and importance of that day. So she would tell me about history and about what that particular day meant. And of course, we used to also joke about whether it was the 11th second and things like that. And so I miss my mother, of course I do, and was thinking not about that anecdote as much as the story that she used to tell me when I would say to her, you know, Ma, that's a common way of South Africans calling their mum, as they call them Ma. You know, Ma, who's this Mandela that people talk about? We're not allowed to say that man's name. Who's this guy? I mean, you know, I'm a teenager, 13, curious, hearing stories as you do, urban stories and things, people talking. And I would say, Ma, who is Mandela? And she would tell me about this great man who shouldn't be in jail and how important he was in our country and how important he was indeed to the future of our country. And so I guess I wanted to start because I was feeling nostalgic and thinking about the 11th as one does, to answer also very, very obliquely and perhaps very superficially the question that someone put me about what was it like to grow up under apartheid, what was your life like? I think you might have asked me that. And it's hard for me to do justice to all these things because of time. But you can see that in that respect, my mum and dad were relatively open-minded, and I grew up in a family which, because of that, also put me in some interesting and challenging circumstances as a teenager, where I disagreed with folk. But she would always tell me this story about Madiba and how she felt about him. So I wanted to start on that note, just to say, of course, even Armistice Day links directly to who Mandela was and who we have come to understand Mandela as being at the core, in fact, of Mandela. Now, I still have no idea how to start, because I was thinking I might, and if I can find it, I will, start with that thing that I once described as the thing that we are simultaneously proud of and ashamed of, because that's really where I want to head in terms of one of the biggest achievements, if you like, of Mandela and his legacy. And so I wanted to show you perhaps two excerpts from the way in which the Truth and Reconciliation Commission functioned in order to get to the part relating to Nelson Mandela and his legacy of forgiveness and reconciliation. So I think I might start there. The footage is taken from the public broadcasts that related to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, so it was broadcast, as all my other bits have been, across the entire country. And this first snippet is about accountability in some respects. It's about someone saying, I did something, and the Commission's attempt to try and pin that down. It's about 5 or 6 minutes. There was, of course, a lot of denial. There was a lot of amnesia, a lot of white amnesia. There's a lot of denial. So there were documents that surfaced in an ongoing fashion during the functioning of this commission. And you will see, in fact, the Minister of Foreign Affairs being given some of these documents and having been asked by a commissioner to translate some of the Afrikaans words used in these documents. He will be going through this process of translating of these words. And I won't get to the point where they ask him questions about it. I just want to give you this by way of introduction. Then I propose to talk a bit about Mandela just as he's released, and then, of course, after he's released, his role in the first free and democratic elections in our country, and, of course, a bit about him as a president. And this is where we would go full circle into the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is where I'm starting. So if that sounds okay, I'd show you about 5 minutes of footage, and then I propose to proceed.
It's very timely because Aung San Suu Kyi
Yes.
party is being elected.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. And so she has opportunities that she's never had. So in that sense, thank you, that's history of this type.
Hello. Our main focus tonight is on the 4 cabinet ministers who appeared before the Truth Commission this past week. But we also have a report on the role that Intelezi, some people call it Muti, plays in a conflict in KwaZulu-Natal. Let me introduce you to the 4 actors who starred in this week's drama. Pik Botha, Minister of Foreign Affairs between 1977 and 1994.
En ek gee nie vanaand om of Oliver Tambo deur Reagan ontmoet word nie. En of hy deur Gorbachev ontmoet word nie. En of hy deur Kohl ontmoet word nie. En of hy deur Margaret Thatcher ontmoet word nie, of die koningin van Brittanje ontmoet word nie. Hierdie regering onderhandel nie met wreedaards en terroriste oor die toekoms van Suid-Afrika nie.
This government does not negotiate with cowards and terrorists about the future of our country, the Minister of Foreign Affairs. And he was saying he doesn't care if Oliver Tambo is met by the Queen or by Gorbachev or by anyone. He refuses to negotiate with the enemy.
Adrian Vlok, Deputy Minister of Defence between 1984 and 1986, and Minister of Law and Order between 1986 and 1991.
Baie dankie.
Minister, baie
Dankie vir jou wat. Hele keer wees aan baie kyk. Baie dankie. Baie dankie.
Rolf Meyer, Deputy Minister of Law and Order between 1986 and 1988, and Minister of Defence between August 1991 and May 1992.
We've achieved tremendous success over the last year in that regard. I must say that I think the spirit of resistance is still there. It's true. And for that reason, we believe that we have to maintain a state of emergency.
Leon Wessels, Deputy Minister of Law and Order in 1988.
Ek wil waarsku dat die regering en die Suid-Afrikaanse polisie geen radikale optrede sal dood nie.
I want to warn that the South African police and the South African military will not tolerate any radical activity.
Former ministers were called to the Truth Commission because they were members of the State Security Council. Former State President P.W. Botha, former Defence Minister Magnus Malan, and National Intelligence boss Neil Barnard will be called before the Commission in George next month. The Truth Commission focused on the State Security Council because that was the body, rather than the Cabinet or the White Parliament, that determined policy and strategy in the turbulent 1980s. Almost a government inside a government. The Council effectively took over government under the reign of P.W. Botha because of his belief that there was a total communist onslaught against the country that made a total strategy of counter-revolutionary measures necessary. P.W. Botha was the head of the State Security Council. He was joined by the Ministers of Defence, Law and Order, Foreign Affairs and Justice, and occasionally other cabinet ministers were also co-opted. The Chief of the Defence Force, the Commissioner of the Police, the Head of the National Intelligence, and the Secretaries of Foreign Affairs and Justice, nowadays called Directors General, were also permanent members. The Council had a full-time administrative office called the Secretariat, dominated by the military. The next step down was the 11 Joint Management Centres, or JMCs, subdivided into sub-JMCs and mini-JMCs. They were responsible for coordinating state departments on regional and local level who had to implement State Security Council policies. The question has been asked many, many times by the Truth Commission in the last few months. Did the State Security Council order the gross violations of human rights by policemen and soldiers, like assassinations, torture, and massacres? And did they know of these violations committed by the security police and units such as Vlakplaas and the CCB? So far, politicians and generals, including former State President F.W. de Klerk, have said they never ordered anything illegal, and they only heard of the abuses when it became known during Truth Commission hearings. Fortunately, many Security Council documents still exist, and from these documents, ordinary people like me understand very easily that the Council did order murders and assassinations. Like this one of 24 January 1987. It states clearly, identify and eliminate the revolutionary leaders, and especially those with charisma. Then, of course, we hear from generals and politicians that eliminate did not mean kill. But let's look at this State Security Council document of 18 February 1980. The Council agreed to continually consider the implications of the elimination of Rhodesian politicians. Then it explains what this means. It is pointed out that the failed attempts to kill Mugabe are turning him into a martyr. So, in this case, elimination did mean kill. But let's go to this week's hearing to find out what the former cabinet members say they ordered and what they knew.
This is the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and he's now been given these documents, a set of documents, and he's being asked to translate some of the words that have been used in these documents.
Eliminate.
Pardon?
Neutraliseer, neutralize, uitwis, obliterate and or wipe out. Vernietig, destroy. Opspoor en vernietig, track down and destroy. Hou vas, break their grip. Bekamp, fight against, curb, control. Stuit, arrest, stem. Uit die samelewing verwyder, remove from society. Permanent uit die samelewing verwyder, remove permanently from society. Now, how did it happen? Why did it happen?
Certainly the questions uppermost in the minds of Archbishop Tutu and his team this week.
Now, I might want to, and thank you, that's as far as I want to take that little snippet. You can watch it more fully because I'll give it to you in the PowerPoints that get put online. And there's more because then they take the Minister of Police and the Minister of Defense through similar processes in relation to documents. And of course the denial is there all the way, even in the face of all that sort of evidence. And I do want to potentially comment on the comment that was made about Nuremberg trials, because I want to sharply distinguish and differentiate this amazing process from, indeed, Nuremberg trials. But you have a question, sir.
When did the Truth and Reconciliation Commission become established, and what authority was it given? What power did it have?
Yeah, and so it would be a great subject actually for an Osher series, to be perfectly frank with you. If you wanted me back, that would be a wonderful question. We could simply say, you know, did it work or something, what, etc. And so there's a lot to say. And I'm going to answer the two together, but I need to also navigate in different directions. It was established in it started working in 96. There was an act, Truth and Reconciliation Act, that was passed by Parliament in 95. It specified so it laid out the ingredients for the commission. So it was legally set up. It had a limited time frame, 2-year time frame for its work. And of course now we can begin to start seeing how I might talk about, you know, what worked and what didn't work. How can you reconcile in 2 years? Its remit was 1960 to 1994. And again, one can ask questions around its chronological remit. And it operated in a quasi-judicial way. So it had powers to subpoena. It could say folk have to come and appear. We know of one famous South African person who didn't come, the great crocodile, P.W. Botha. He's named the great crocodile because he was exactly like you might see a great crocodile in your mind. And so it had those quasi-judicial powers then also to subpoena and indeed to grant amnesty. And how was amnesty achieved? It was achieved if you told the entire truth, if it was deemed that you were telling the entire truth and you had a political motive. Those two things together would get you off the hook, so to speak. It also considered reparations, and that's an entire subject which we can spend, you know, a few lectures on, because that, and there are many folk, indeed growing numbers of folk in South Africa, who say we've bungled the reparations side of the equation. Amnesty was immediate. You appeared before the commission, they listened to your story, they thought you were telling the truth, they thought you had a political motive, you got amnesty. Reparations didn't happen with the same immediacy. If you were a victim, you felt that time lag. You felt that there was a murderer or someone who had done something really awful. They'd gotten amnesty with relative immediacy. You were waiting. And there were formulae and approaches to reparations which were pretty insulting, to be quite frank with you. $3,000 for human rights abuses that were simply horrific murder and so forth. And much more. It's an entire complex area, just the question of reparations, the question of amnesty, the question of the functioning of the TRC. It had a forensics unit. It could go out and research. It indeed was compelled by the Constitutional Court at one point to make sure that it had sought all avenues for evidence in order to come to its conclusions. And there were huge questions in relation to what constituted reparations, what constituted reconciliation, what constituted reconciliation for individuals versus communities. I have some very interesting footage of someone, a captain in the police force, who went back to a community where he had perpetrated some pretty awful abuses, and how that played out. So this is really, I guess, a huge question. Why didn't we want Nuremberg trials? Well, quite simply, folk could fly in that instance, conduct these trials, find Nazis guilty, and leave. And you had a conqueror and a conquered, and it was a pretty clear victor situation there. Well, in South Africa, we all have to live together. There's no single part of us, whether we're white, sorry to use the racist terminology, white, black, colored, or Indian, that's going to come in, hold a trial, and go. We have to live with each other. We have to get on with each other. We have to figure things out together. We have to continue to find a future together. We have to share that future together.
Did it all happen down in Georgia?
You mean the entire truth and reconciliation process? Now, so George is where and that's where, so there's a place called the Wilderness, which is where the great crocodile lived. And so it didn't happen down there, although there might have been a hearing there. So the idea was a traveling roadshow type thing, because access to the commission and its functioning was hugely important. So not only was access to information important, which is why we published everything, we put it on the news. It was in fact open to the world media to participate. We also went around from town to town to town, town hall to town hall, school to school, to try and make it possible for folk to turn up and participate as observers, unfortunately as victims, but also as perpetrators. And of course, if perpetrators didn't turn up, they opened themselves up to prosecution. So the idea was, come and if you tell the truth and you've got a political motive, we want to know what happened during apartheid. Come and tell us that, and fine, you'll get amnesty. If you don't, you open yourself up. And of course, if you didn't get amnesty, then you similarly were open to criminal and civil prosecution. Yes, sir?
Yes, it was a very good book that was written by the Archbishop, on the operation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It's available in paperback.
Yeah.
It's great inspiration.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And much that has been written about the TRC and indeed the mechanics of the negotiated settlement, because that's the other subject, is we could talk about the anatomy of the negotiation process, how that all played out. That's a story within a story. I'm going to get to you in a moment. And there are many books published also about how we could have done it better, what we could have done differently, etc., which are all great, because we need to, we're the first to recognize that in many respects we charted unknown territory. When we constructed the negotiation process, when we thought about the TRC, when we did all this stuff, in many respects we were stabbing in the dark. We were brave. We were very brave. We came together and we said we're going to discuss this stuff together, and we want to construct a new South Africa. But we have to do that ourselves. And part of that also is about, how do you feel if you get told to do something and you may not necessarily want to, or it's templated on you. It has a different kind of power than if we sit down together, uncertain of the outcome, but co-constructing it and sharing the development of that outcome together. That's how we felt about the processes that we put in place, because we would jointly share those processes if we jointly created them. And so I'm not saying this wasn't a perfect process. It wasn't as perfect as that. There was a lot of Machiavellian horse trading going on, especially in the early days. But as we grew to the understanding that we needed to find something together, we pretty much changed our mindsets as negotiators to kind of embrace this different approach. I had a question here and then there.
Did the U.S. government play any part at all? Were they in touch with the TRC, or were they consulted, or did they send representatives?
So I think we South Africans like to do everything ourselves. And so of course we were open to the world, and of course we researched things, and we would have asked the government and other folk views and so forth. But these were our processes. We didn't want external mediators in the negotiation process. We didn't necessarily want external folk in these processes about reconciliation, because they were literally us healing our relationships with each other, or attempting to heal our relationships. So we did research. Folk would have consulted widely, but ultimately those were South African processes run by South Africans in the main. Experts will have played roles, but not key roles. Yes, sir?
During this process, did the victims have equal time to testify also?
Yes. Yes, so fairness and equality in terms of testifying. I'll show you a little snippet of how that went. So you would literally have the victim and the perpetrator in the same room. They'd see each other. And so they would tell their stories. They would have legal representation if they wanted it. Often they did, especially in certain contested cases. Let me say that the product, the TRC, wasn't produced. It wasn't birthed easily. Mandela played a key role. I want to talk about that. If it in fact wasn't for Mandela, we possibly wouldn't have had a TRC, possibly, and perhaps not in its form and shape that it took. I think so. And so political parties didn't want this. You know, de Klerk had surreptitiously given 3,500 policemen amnesty just before the election. And when Mandela found out about this, he was livid. And Mandela was always opposed to a general amnesty. He never wanted a general amnesty. But people in his own party didn't want a TRC either. And the report, in fact, you know, Tutu is on record as saying that, you know, that this commission is being challenged in court more than anything else, because it was challenged over and over by Buthelezi, by the Zulus. It was challenged by the African National Congress. It was challenged by the widows of Biko and others. It was challenged by the National Party. The final report was a challenging thing, you know, it was challenging enough for folk who felt this way to take it to court. And so Tutu spent time, you know, I mean, you know, he quips about these things, but he spent time. So the TRC had to defend itself, and not only from legal challenge, but also from perception, that it was biased in one way or another, that it was out to get whites, that it was a witch hunt seeking revenge, and that it was focused only on white folk, when of course it wasn't. And of course, you know, black folk and others who had perpetrated atrocities appeared before it and were subject to the same approach and discipline in terms of procedure and protocol. So an entirely interesting thing in and of its own right, an entirely interesting thing to talk about. And thank you for the questions. I was going to say I felt bad about last time because we didn't have time for dialogue. And so I'm quite pleased that we're having a good dialogue today, because I'd rather answer questions, in fact, today than even talk too formulaically about things. So if you have questions on your mind, put your hand up and we'll take them as we move along.
Was amnesty legislated by the white legislature?
So no. That's, you know, and I was going to get to this because there's this entire debate about horses and carts and how you put the horse before the cart. And our whole process was contested between the National Party and the ANC in terms of what should occur first. And if you're in a negotiated process, how can you have legitimacy in discussions if you haven't had elections and then got folk who've been elected to talk about and do certain things? And our constitution is a good example of that. And the compromise then was, we'll do an interim constitution before an election and a final constitution after an election. And this is in the spirit then of the wisdom that emerges once you've had a few, you know, heads locked together and stoppages of talks, and then begin to say, well, there are ways in which we can deal with some of these things. And so this question of amnesty was put in law in 95, which was after the election. And so that was passed by the first democratically elected parliament in South Africa. So it was a post-94 parliament. And of course it was Mandela who was president at that time. So the entire legislation, including amnesty, was put in place by a democratically elected parliament and passed in that way. I think I've lost track of time. I want to say that and remind you that in jail, in his last years in jail, he was being prepared for freedom. And I want to remind you of that. But I want to also remind you of this question of how he was being prepared for freedom and why he was being prepared for freedom. And of course, these secret discussions that I mentioned, these were going on between the National Party representatives and Mandela. And the National Party representatives in that period, 85, 86 to 90, they were continuing to insist that Mandela abandon his links with the Communist Party, that Mandela give up the armed struggle, and perhaps most importantly, that he abandon his idea of democracy and majority rule. Yeah? And so these government negotiators were insisting that he abandon these things. They were insisting that he give up on these things. And I'm grateful for the laughter, I really am, because it's ridiculous. But think about this. Those sticking points, including that last one, it remained a sticking point into the negotiation process, into the early 90s, even whilst the African National Congress and the National Party were negotiating. They weren't moving, they weren't budging on this idea of democracy and majority rule. Yeah? So what was going on here was this particular mastermind, Neil Barnard, the director of intelligence, simply wanted to split Mandela off from the African National Congress. Can you imagine any greater victory for him with his right-wing views and these ideas of abandoning democracy in favor of what he liked to talk about as the protection of minority rights, which sounds in one sense like, you know, you might somehow get that, but in the context of apartheid, you might also see what you might protect if you were protecting minority rights. And of course, if he could have got Mandela to espouse his views and split him off from the African National Congress and say, hey, here's Mandela, he's saying what we're saying, fantastic. So it was classic divide and rule, and we heard about how that had happened under the British, and we heard also in these sessions about how that had happened with black chiefs, and how Mandela felt at that time about the fact that there were black chiefs who were giving powers from the center and money, but then had to toe the political line. Now, his biographer, and this is important, I really want to, if I leave now, after I've emphasized this point, I'm actually quite happy, because then I've spoken about reconciliation, and I've spoken about this point, because a lot of people will say, well, some people will say, so Clive, what was the effect of incarceration on Mandela? Did they soften him? Did they change his thinking? Did they bring him over? And some folk will say, you know, that is what happened. Well, no. And his biographer points this out. His biographer says, in fact, Bezos, who, if I have time, George Bezos, the lawyer, the African National Congress lawyer, says they thought they could corrupt him, like some of the other Bantustan leaders, some of the other so-called black homeland leaders. They'd created these homelands, remember, that black folk were meant to go and live in. They were temporary sojourners, and they'd have citizenship in their own ethnic homelands. It was their misjudgment, in fact, the biographer says, that led to his release. Once the National Party had started to negotiate, Mandela got the upper hand, and they couldn't turn back, partly because the country was on fire outside, and partly because they believed with this divide and rule strategy they could dominate the negotiation process that they saw emerging at some point after his release. And so on page 380 of the biography, you will see Sampson saying, at Victor Verster, Mandela was already taking charge. I kind of feel like we've had a lot of Q&A, and I'm not sure what I might want to leave out in favor of what I want to include. And I know there's some good stuff at the end that I don't want to miss out on, but I might just eschew the footage and just keep pushing forward, because I want to talk a bit about the use of imagery, and Mandela the myth, and Mandela the icon, and Mandela and the symbolism surrounding Mandela, and Mandela himself, in knowing that he had that he was indeed a master of the use of symbolism and imagery. In fact, we know that he cultivated this image himself, and besides the fact that the media dubbed him the Black Pimpernel, we know that he cultivated that unkempt Che Guevara revolutionary look with a beard and so forth when he went underground, the guerrilla leader image. His biographer talks about his great occasions and the way in which he knew that these great occasions, the Rivonia trial when he was sentenced to lifetime in prison, his inauguration as president, and I want to add a third one. He knew how to manipulate the symbolism around those. Remember, ladies and gentlemen, when he was put on trial for his life, he turned up in full Xhosa chief regalia. He turned up like that. So what was he saying? You know, this Western court, this apartheid court, I'm an African chief. He was speaking to an African constituency and a South African constituency, and of course his Xhosa heritage, and showing solidarity by dressing up like that. The third one I wanted to add was, of course, his great moment was his release. And that was symbolism, which I describe as chaotic use of symbolism, because nothing went according to planning there very much. But it was one of those world occasions. I don't know if you saw it on television. You might have. You might have. I would imagine that some folk around the world saw some of that. But certainly we were riveted by his release. He was grandly operatic, is the way that his biographer describes him. He was flamboyant. He liked to put on a show. And you'll remember that I spoke about him doing that in court. That was his legal style. He was a flamboyant, charismatic lawyer. How far did the imagery around Mandela connect with the reality of Mandela the man? Well, it is true to say two things about Mandela. Mandela recognized the importance of the collectivity, the people, and he recognized the importance especially and sought solace and fortitude and strength from the folk who were incarcerated with him, Walter Sisulu and Ahmed Kathrada and others. But at heart, he was a loner. He was a lone person, and he had this strong sense of personal leadership. That he was a leader, and that he was comfortable in himself being a leader, and that he was able on his own to be that leader. He was a strong individual. And this second point about personal leadership and his sense of being a personal leader is another of his legacies that, so besides reconciliation, that I would emphasize is one of the factors to which we owe our survival as a country, that we averted civil war, that he indeed was the lone leader that he was. Because had he been locked up in jail, had he been subject to all these niceties, a 3-bedroomed home with a swimming pool, seeing visitors, seeing Winnie again, and negotiating with the National Party, had he not had this strong moral fortitude to say, I will not give up the struggle for democracy. I stand on my principle, and no matter what you offer me, I'm not going to budge. On his own, divided in fact. Now remember, he went from Robben Island to Pollsmoor, and there in Pollsmoor he still had some of his friends around him. to Victor Verster, where Barnard knew, I've got this man on my own. I'm going to ply him with all sorts of things. And I've got this whole house bugged, and I can hear everything that's going on in there. If you go there, the garden was bugged. We South Africans call a barbecue a braai. The place where he braaied was bugged. I saw the hole in the piece of wood. It's got a thatched thing on it. The whole place was bugged. Barnard was listening. He never gave up in terms of principle, and that's a particular type of leader that's gone through 27 years of jail and is still saying, there's only one thing, I'm not going to give up on these things. This is all I'm interested in. So this question of personal leadership was decisive. There's no doubt he created the myth himself as well. Yes. So that's, there's so much fun and detail in these things, and we could take so many wonderful meanders. I really do wish we had, multiples of these, because he did. And he knew there was this one room where the washer was, and it would make this noise. And if he wanted to talk, he'd go in there. And there would be this, whatever, the noise the machines make. And that would help him. He knew the garden was bugged. Why? Because he loved to garden. He was a keen gardener. He liked to go. He used to wake up at 4:30 in the morning. He was a early to bed, early to rise kind of guy, and used to go out there and garden. Would pull these things up and see it. He knew it, and he used it. So, and we'll talk about So we talk about the reconciliation that emerged from Mandela's heart, and the fact that he came out of jail and said, I don't want revenge, I want reconciliation. But we also know he was a Machiavellian politician, and this is why he himself says he was no angel. He knew how to play these games, and he was adept and astute at it, and because of that, as much as because of anything else, we again can say single-handedly he, in many respects, helped us through this process. He established his own mythology, ladies and gentlemen. Why did he do that? Because he knew that he had to challenge the racist regime also in the context of its powerful myths, and felt that he had to create some powerful myths to counterbalance those powerful myths that were put in place by the Afrikaner. Think about the myths of black inferiority. Think about the myths of white supremacy. Think about the myth of their God-given right to occupy and rule that land. Think about the myths relating to the incompatibility between the races. He knew he had to create myths of his own to counter some of that nonsense. And by the way, I made a note here. There's a book by Stephen Jay Gould. If some of you come across Gould, called The Mismeasure of Man. Read that and be shocked and horrified. When you think about the origins of apartheid and you think about where all this stuff came from, So think about the American and the European experience, predating and running parallel with stuff that was happening. And if you're interested in all of that, the scientific evidence for differences between the races, the way folk were measured and sought empirical evidence for the difference between the races and so forth. Read The Mismeasure of Man and be horrified. Eugenics, etc. It's a great scientific contribution by a great scientist. Stephen Jay Gould is an awesome scientist who's made some massive contributions to biology, but he wrote much more widely. He also had to give confidence to people who had been conditioned into submission. And I say conditioned because they had also been brutalized. They'd been physically brutalized into submission. by the military machine, but they had been conditioned psychologically into submission as well. And so he needed to personify dignity, African self-respect, African self-worth. He needed to personify that, and he became the personification of that by his very demeanor, by the very way in which he wanted people to see him, which was proud to be who he was. How am I doing for time? Okay, thank you. An important point was his ineptness as a military leader. He knew he was inept as a military leader. He knew that he wasn't a very realistic military commander. He underestimated his enemy's strength. And in fact, his own autobiography and his political writing shows that he, for example, made careless mistakes when he was caught, which is possibly why he doesn't necessarily chase after CIA complicity and so much, because he was just as careless about factors that go into being a military or a soldier, a military person. Mandela could never avoid committing to the armed struggle. Why was that? Why could Mandela not avoid committing to the armed struggle? Because we know he formed Umkhonto we Sizwe. We know he was saying to Luthuli and others, we need this armed wing, and we need to pick up guns. Why could he not? Now that's of course a big question, and part of that we've tried to answer in relation to the context and the world that he found himself in. But remember that he would have also not had as much black support as he got, because especially black young men were pouring into his office, but certainly in the streets as well, saying, if you don't give us a gun, we're going to find a gun. And if you don't give us a bomb, we're going to find a bomb. And we are. It's literally true. And so part of the option as well is to say, well, on the one hand, you could have an uncontrolled military-type chaotic scene. And on the other, you could say, well, how can I, in the interests of this country, channel some of that raw hurt, some of that raw pain, some of that visceral hurt that's experienced daily by people? How can I channel that in meaningful ways that make sense? And where I might, now we know no one really had ultimate control over a lot of this stuff. Sometimes anger bursts up and it does awful things. But part of this was also saying, well, we need a structure. We need to think about channeling the anger of the masses. But we know that this occurred within the context of his commitment many times to, I think I mentioned the headline in the paper, to a national parley. And we spoke about the extent to which he was supportive of a national convention and the extent to which he always wanted a process of negotiation. And indeed, he chose to initiate those negotiations whilst he was in jail. He was always an advocate for and a strong supporter of a controversial thing known as sanctions. Historians are divided in my country as to the efficacy of sanctions. There are arguments both ways, but Mandela always believed they should be in place and they should persist, and indeed he advocated them well into the negotiation process itself. He believed that international pressure and sanctions were essential to bringing down the apartheid regime. His prison ordeal had transformed him into a reflective person, an influential person. He learned a lot about human sensitivity to the plight and position of human beings. And in particular, he paid a lot of attention to understanding the psyche of the Afrikaner, his enemy. He paid a lot of attention to talking to warders, to reading about the Afrikaner, to trying to understand the mindset and worldview of these people who had put him jail. Yes, sir.
While he was in jail, is there any evidence that he reached out or looked for outside guidance from people like Kennedy and others when they had come to his message?
I think the evidence points more to reaching out to improve conditions in jail than to get that sort of advice. And part of that would have been, even had he sought it, I would imagine that it would have been prohibited and it would have been censored. And so had he sought anything to do with the struggle in South Africa, the prison authorities would have not allowed that, because we know his letters were being censored. We know that they were watching him very closely, and indeed the frequency of communication, which increased over time, meant he would have probably wanted to write his loved ones first and try to get a letter back from someone like Winnie or his children or something, because he would have. And I say that, but I might just contradict myself in a moment. But I don't think he managed that much. That's not to say the movement wasn't, but I think he would have been challenged, particularly challenged on that respect. And let me contradict myself. Can I quickly contradict myself and then take the question? Because I like to contradict myself. There was a thing that drove Mandela during his incarceration, but especially also afterwards, which is known as guilt. It's a really challenging emotion, guilt. Yeah, and so being in jail meant he couldn't be with his wife and children. He wasn't there for his mother or his son when they were killed. So you can see also the extent to which he stood by Winnie, the love of his life. Now it may be that Grassa also was. I'm not so entirely sure about that, but certainly Winnie was. He loved her. He stood by her, and even when she was convicted, up to the point where she was convicted, he walked to court with her. He loved her. All the things she had gone through as a single mother, living in Soweto with his two daughters, where at times when these military tanks used to drive by, they would shoot gratuitously into her home. She built a wall in that home. Go there and see it for yourselves, to protect herself and her babies. And of course, now, gender difference is an interesting thing, because there's this question of equality and complementarity, and I'm all for equality and I'm all for complementarity. And in his case, of course, he felt, as a man might, that couldn't protect his wife and daughters. So he was guilty. He was guilty about that. He felt guilty about that. He also felt guilty about folk that he'd used, friends that he'd used during his political career. And so I guess I'm describing, Mandela the human being, because that's who he was, and that's what he was, and that's absolutely a perspective on him which he recognized, which is recognized in his biography, and which is important to know that he recognized this. He was concerned about his own icon, his own image, the symbolism. I do apologize. I had completely...
answering my question, because that's what I was going to ask you. With the intensive censorship that was occurring by the government, how did he continue to maintain himself as an icon so that when he was able to get out of prison, he could take his place as the leader?
So his party did a lot of that. The African National Congress did a lot of that, especially in exile and in the places they were situated in the international community.
Articles that I studied at the university because I was studying communism, and he was considered Oliver Tambo was considered a bridge between
And so there were these kinds of efforts, and propagandist efforts, so there'd be pamphlets and things. So of course everyone uses propaganda, and the ANC would have made sure that a lot of these leaflets that ended up in the townships and so forth with his image, which would be confiscated by police and so forth. So that's how that would have happened.
All the image when he was kind of heavy set with the beard. That was what you saw.
Exactly, that's right. Yeah, that's right. And that's how that seeped into the international consciousness as much as it did locally as well. And then, of course, there was an intricate mechanism of secret communication already on Robben Island that just got more elaborate as Mandela moved from prison to prison, which enabled also strategic communication, which was very difficult. So he was aware of his icon. He was very aware of the dangers of a personality cult. He was concerned with the personality cult that might develop around him. He didn't like that. And certainly he was also aware of the personality cults which had occurred in other African countries, and indeed, as the biographer notes, had misled folk in other African countries. So very much a human being, very much concerned on the one hand with the use of his image, but on the other hand with what that might bring about in the context of power and so forth. When he took he took some critical decisions in his life. One was probably to form Umkhonto we Sizwe, but another was certainly to enter into talks with the South African government, and he took that decision alone, as consultative as he was, as consultative as he'd grown up, as important as the movement was for him, and he always put the movement, the African National Congress, first. He took that decision on his own to enter into discussions with the government, and in fact, Joe Slovo, the leader of the Communist Party, and then later Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and in fact my own personal view, all say that without this decision of Mandela to reach out to the government and talk, South Africa could have taken a hugely different turn. There's a great book by Greenblatt called The Swerve. It was on your bookseller lists and things. It's an awesome book. It's about moments, of course, in history that cause swerves. It's about Lucretius. So where did the fact that Mandela was so reconciliatory, where did that emerge from? How did that come about? Yeah, because that's kind of sort of seminal. It's kind of important. And his yeah, sir.
His mother.
So his mother might have played a role. I don't know. And certainly his upbringing, because the African emphasis on reconciliation and rehabilitation rather than revenge and retribution, also in the context of law. And if I have a chance, I'll show you Desmond Tutu talking about that. It would have been, so I would think you're right. I think his family, his mother, his upbringing, and also his personal development whilst incarcerated, where he learned to tame that aggressive impulse that he used to have when he would storm this podium and knock me off and tell me he disagreed with me. Very obviously, he learned to control his aggression. He learned to subordinate many of his personal feelings, his emotions and feelings, to his central purpose, and in fact became a kind of impenetrable fortress. Even his friends described him as an impenetrable fortress, as a solitary, impenetrable forces. He showed, in fact, he surprised everyone, including his biographer, when he emerged from jail. Not only because of his political shrewdness, but mainly because of his humility, because of his humanity, because of his simplicity in the way that he lived his life. He'd become confident in his own abilities, and I quote, and had a warmth and humor that gave him immediate rapport with a wide range of people. But especially he showed no sign of the so-called familiar deformities of power, egomania, pomposity, or even paranoia, which had afflicted so many leaders, certainly in the so-called developing world. And just before, if I have time to go into the election phase and the presidential phase, he, as his biographer notes, had a moral authority and concern for the truth, which few could compete with. Through his entire incarceration, he remained true to his beliefs and principles, and I think I mentioned this earlier on, in the face of all sorts of temptations and pressures. And certainly once he'd been released, he continued to be immune to these kinds of temptations and pressures, which many politicians at this time in the early 90s and then the late 90s, many politicians were beginning to succumb to all sorts of temptations. And quite frankly, if one looks at South Africa now, one does not see even the smallest vestige of Mandela in the current leadership. And it is true to say that when he retired and went to Tunu, his family and friends had to keep him away from the TV and had to hide away the newspapers from him. Because he was horrified by, or could have been horrified by what he would read in them. He would not want to have heard about the corruption that seems to be endemic in institutions, etc. So he saw himself as true to these principles. He believed in these things. He lived his life like that. And always he saw himself as a country boy who had a sense of belonging in South Africa, rootedness as an African in Africa, and who was ultimately governed by this idea of Ubuntu. Now, I wanted to talk a bit about the factors that opened up the path to peace in South Africa. But if someone would be so kind as to give me a sense of the time. Pardon? 12:05, so I've got 10 minutes left. 10 minutes left. All right. Never. Are there any questions?
Tell us about your shirt.
About the shirt? I'm not going to talk about my shirt. I would love to. I would love to tell you what I do at Vanderbilt. But I'm not going to. Because my shirt so it's the shirt from my office. It's the Office of Active Citizenship and Service. So besides teaching in the political science department, and indeed medicine, health and society, I also run a thing called the Office of Active Citizenship and Service. And what it really does is, I mean, I do respect your question, I don't mean to be rude, is ensure that students have opportunities to serve locally, nationally and globally. They do volunteer service everywhere. So I try to encourage that service and to make those opportunities available. So we have lots of connections in our local community, and if we could have more, we would welcome that. And if there's anything we could do together, we'd love to do that. We send folk, unsurprisingly, to South Africa, and we do service in a township there. Quito, Ecuador, Rabat, Morocco, London, England, and so forth. So it literally is about service, and the other component is about what does it mean to be an active citizen in the world. Millennials apparently registered to vote at the level of about 17% or something. I mean, come on, you know. And then how do you get active? This is not I'm on film. This is not a criticism of millennials. I forgot about that camera after the first 10 minutes I was in this room in lecture number 1, and now all of a sudden I've become very aware of that camera. I love millennials. But please register to vote. And so, so it's not just about Facebook and Twitter and stuff. It's about being active in the world. What might that look like? What could we do to support folk to be active? How can we also, because certainly Vandy students have many amazing ideas, how can we help bring those ideas to fruition? So we literally do try and encourage and support and work with our students to be active citizens, to be informed, to be engaged, to participate, and then also to serve. So that's the humble sort of objective of the Office of Active Citizenship and Service. But you know, I really am keen to talk about Mandela and that, because I'm nothing without him, and we are small in the context of him. Yes, sir.
What would you say is his legacy that has remained as a positive part of South African life today?
Yeah. It's a really hard question for me to answer, because it hurts me to answer the question. Because on the one hand, I would say South Africans have forgotten. South Africans need to remember. South Africans need to understand what he did. South Africans need to go back to that and say, we want to recapture the morals and values of that man. We want to capture again and live out the spirit of Mandela. Because, you know, if we can make a fast buck off the Mandela name, then we'll make a fast buck. But is that really who we are? Is that really what we want? Is that really what we're saying? When what we ought to be saying is, what did he do for us? What was his legacy? And if you think about his legacy, of course he came out of that jail saying, I want processes to bring us together. But if we look at the research, and indeed if you go to South Africa, how many white South Africans have got black friends, and how many black South Africans have got white friends?
How many Afrikaners have English friends? How many English have Afrikaner friends?
And where do we live? And how do we live? How have we continued to replicate the segregation of apartheid?
Glass on top of the wall.
You know, the townships still exist in the way they existed.
They got hot water and electricity and toilets.
Well, you know, do they?
Yeah.
No, they don't. And so we need to see that development occur at a much faster pace. Yeah? And part of that development relates to remembering what Tata Madiba taught us, which is we have to get those relationships right. And we haven't. We haven't. And so, pardon? It's still separate. It's still separate. Yes, sir?
Is part of your teaching and research to write a book and give your perspective, or have you done that already?
So, let me just say one thing before I answer that. That, of course, the context of development and change in South Africa is a hugely challenging one. And South Africans, in many respects, despite the picture I've just painted, have done some amazing things. And so we shouldn't underestimate the impact of apartheid and the challenge of fixing it. And so within that context, and of course I'm harsh in my criticism because of the current leadership, I go at it in a very hard way. It would not make me friends at that level at all. But you know what? I don't need those friends. I like to write nonsense. So I spend my time writing stories, flights of fancy, flights of fantasy, stuff that I'm, you know, and I'm working on something that I might publish one day. And people have often said to me, Clive, you should get something academic out, and you should do a book, and you might want to think a little bit about what that might contain. But I've never really been attracted to academic writing. Maybe my doctorate traumatized me.
It's quite a process.
What is the subject?
So I am tempted, and maybe I shouldn't say this on film, but I have a stash of top secret papers that I got from the previous apartheid regime, and probably I'll go to my office now and photograph them before you put this on YouTube. And in fact, I have this idea to potentially do something which might include a critique of transition, because I've begun to talk about that publicly now. I've begun to critique the transition with the benefit of hindsight, sure, but looking back at it and saying there might have been one or two things that we could have done a little differently that might have got us in a different place. And thank you for the prod, the gentle prod. What was the question?
What was the topic of your?
Oh, it was on cooperative governance. So it was all about the relationship between the newly formed levels of government and Chapter 3 of the then new Constitution, which kind of had prescriptions in it about cooperative governance and how to bring that about. It's really about intergovernmental relations. So that would be, in a nutshell, sort of looking at those relationships and how they might function in a cooperative fashion. I don't know. I mean, I think I can't get to the elections and to the TRC. I can't get to that film. I think I'm done. I see folk coming to the front. So.
That was not a signal to stop, just a warning.
You know, you warn someone who grew up under apartheid and they immediately take the warning seriously. It's like, yes, sir, no, sir, I'm out of here. I'll do whatever you say. No. Let me just say thank you so much. You guys are, thank you. Thank you.